Bayside Folsom, good morning. There it is. I was at the Folsom Farmers Market yesterday. Was anybody else there? Yep, few of you. Thanks for saying hey. But I was there yesterday with some of our friends and some of the staff from our church, most notably for this story, Brannon and Kaylee Annis. Brannon is our production lead here at Bayside Folsom. Kaylee is our comms lead here at Bayside Folsom. And they just had baby number 2. Let me introduce all of our church to Bodie Ray. Aww, he is so cute and perfect and small and tiny. He is amazing. He just slept the whole time we were there. But for Brannon and Kaylee to have baby number 2, they first had to have baby number 1. Now, baby number 1 for Brannon and Kaylee is who I believe is the single most beloved person at this church. Of any kid, though all of our kids are raised with love around here, of any adult, and we're really welcoming and accepting around here, the most loved person at Bayside Folsom is Maverick Annis. You've probably seen Maverick running around causing destruction and mayhem. He is doing all kinds of stuff, just being himself. He's an amazing kid. He's fully alive. So we're at the farmer's market yesterday, and he's just running the entire time we're there. We're at an hour and a half, and he's just sprinting. If you've been to the farmer's market in historic Folsom, by the parking garage in the far corner, there's always an artist there or a guitarist or somebody playing a saxophone. Maverick walks right up to the guy playing guitar yesterday, puts his arms in the air and goes, with no prompting. This kid is fully living. Like this kid is our kid. This is a Bayside Folsom kid, and he's just running around, shaking his butt, having so much fun, asking people different questions, talking to little girls, talking to little guys, running around everywhere. But he is in the season of his life, parents, you know what I'm talking about, where he answers all his parents' questions with one word. And it starts with 3, it has 3 letters in it. Why? Why? Anybody been through that season? They're like, Maverick, you have to put pants on to go out in public. Why? You got to put your shoes on, Mav. Why? Mav, you got to do this. Why? He tried to get our baby out of the stroller yesterday. I was like, Mav, baby cow's got to stay in the stroller. Why? Mav, don't punch that kid. Why? Mav, you got to give him a hug. Why? The sun is shining. Why is the sun shining? His parents are like, because it just freaking is. It just is. Stop asking these questions. It's so funny, though, isn't it? That we start off so curious about life, so curious about the world, and at some point, once we've gained some knowledge, or can I just push it a little further, once we've become a little bit disenchanted, we find ourselves as adults often not asking why enough. And in adult life, it's often because we tend to settle for the status quo of the surface rather than to wade into the deep waters of the soul. We get into that same habit of just saying, it just is. It just is. And even in the things that we enjoy or even the matters in our soul that we long for, we get complacent in curiosity. Think about the things you enjoy or long for. Think about music. There's not been a man or a woman ever made in any part of the earth that didn't love when strings were stretched across wood and strummed in a way that moved their soul. We long for music. We long for beauty. We long to be in nature. We long, some of us, for math because math sounds like music to us. We long for laughter, for lovemaking, for family. And you don't long for these things for no reason. And the answer to the reason that we desire them is not, it just is. We just desire these things. This is just what it is. One must not lose the curiosity of why, especially at the inner longings and groanings of us, because there's something behind your yearnings. There's something behind your longings. In what is possibly the greatest sermon ever preached by somebody not named Jesus Christ of Nazareth, C.S. Lewis said in a message he once preached called The Weight of Glory. You're like, I have that book. Yeah, it was one sermon. June 8th, 1941. And he said it like this. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It's not in them. It came through them. What came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they will turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only, listen to this, the scent of the flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, and news from a country we have never yet visited. I'd invite you to write this down, get it tattooed, whatever you have to do to remember this. Our longings are portals. Our longings are portals that peer into the soul, that peer into the universe. Maybe you're new to faith or you're not a believer and you're seeking and you're checking things out. I would even advocate that your longings are portals, perhaps even to God himself, to the something more of your life and world. And when we understand that there's actually something, Bayside Folsom, behind laughter, there's behind the lovemaking, behind the music and the math, behind beauty, then you're actually finally on the brink of understanding what your role is in the world and your role and my role in the universe, not just as settlers, but as explorers of the deeper things. That we are those who explore the depths of the soul and what God's beauty means to the world. And one of the most failed premises of modern time is that you can search for yourself without searching for God. That in a culture that is obsessed with self-actualization and self-help, much of which is good. I'm not here just to drown on all of that. Now, some of it's not and some of it is. And we have to know ourselves. Hear me, I'm not saying the self isn't important. I'm saying sometimes the church has preached die to self and they've done that in a really unhealthy way. Jesus said you have to love your neighbor as you love who? Your self matters, your uniqueness matters, your giftness matters, your story matters, your fingerprint, your skin, your place in time and history all matter. But to seek and obsess over the look within ourselves without looking and searching for God is to miss the forest for the trees. Because fundamentally, if there's a God, that means something about you. And even vice versa. So I repeat to you this morning, our longings are portals to the soul, to the universe, and perhaps the good news is even to God, to the something mores of life. There was a philosopher once named Ron Dart who said it like this: we are caught between modern versions of the world and the haunting of transcendence. So we find ourselves in perpetual unease. This is the unique discomfort of our lives as modern people. And I love that he says that because haunted's the right word. Haunted by the transcendent things. Every one of us, in every person in time and place in history, has asked, does my existence even matter? Does it even matter? Does what I'm doing have purpose? Why do I have this longing inside of me to give back and be connected to something that's bigger than me? It's like we're itching. We're itching to know. And we have this itch and hunch within us that there's something beyond us. But can I say this today? It's not just an itch. It's a longing. Our soul longs for these things. We long for there to be more. We long for there to be good news in the midst of our real pain. We long for hope to be beyond what our eyes can see. And the Bible speaks to this over and over and over again. But one of my favorite clauses in all of the text is the beginning of 119:20 in the Psalms. My soul is consumed with longing. Consumed with it. My assertion to you today is while there are beautiful earthly depictions of longing in good ways, lovemaking, marriage, laughter, connection, companionship, those are beautiful things. But my assertion to you today is this, that our longings ultimately find their home in three things. Three things. Point number one for your notes today is this: the person of God. that our longings find their home in the person of God. There were a group of young men in the Bible named and referred to as the sons of Korah. They're the sons of a Levite tribe, the priestly tribe, and they were musicians. And often I find this in the church, that often the gift of prophecy, that is speaking, foretelling truth into darkness, and at times in biblical history, even foretelling things that are going to come by God's grace, I find that the foretelling of truth to darkness, truth to power, so often even in the church, resides in those who lead worship, who do music. There's something about the way that God knit together the artesian soul to speak truth into things and bring truth out of things that don't quite make sense. So these sons of Korah write just a few psalms scattered throughout the book of Psalms. And they're all songs of contemplative worship, including Psalm 42. Not 41, it's going to say the wrong thing on the screen, my mistake. But in Psalm 42, they write this, directly to the longing of the person of God, speaking to the soul prophetically into the darkness of the world. They write the words, as the deer pants for streams of water. As the deer pants for water, my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. So where can I go to meet with God? Friends, we literally long for a God to exist. I don't care where you came from. I don't care what your belief system is. I don't care whatever distinct, beautiful diversity you have amongst your story. I promise the question for your life is not do you worship? It is what do you worship? Because human beings worship. They can't help it. They just do. Every people group on every continent in every era has worshiped and even worshiped gods. The Egyptians, the Polynesians, the Mayans, the Greeks, from Mesopotamia to Persia, from China to South America, and you'll find similarities in the way that they worship. No matter where you go, you know what you find? Temples, churches, drawings, stories, holy books, sacred writings, sacrifices, priestly systems, prayers, and songs. Every culture, before mass mobilization, before the internet, we are finding artifacts where people are worshiping no matter where they are, independent of knowing the other humans worship, before they've ever interacted with one another. One of the most distinct things about human beings is the fact that they worship because we long for a God to exist. Because at a base level, if God exists, maybe that'll help make sense of why we do. Because if there is a God, if the notion is there is an actual creator that created all of this, then the only real way to find ourselves is to realize why he did this. If there's a God, then maybe we could find us. And if there's a God, maybe that's why love exists. Maybe that's why we long for connection and desire. One of my favorite sociologists from Notre Dame makes the assertion that every healthy society in history has comedy. Public-facing satirical comedy and comedians. That is one of the marks of a healthy culture. Now hear me today. I'm not advocating for everything comedians say. Sometimes in America, we give comedians the only pass to say whatever they want, even if it's ethically sinful. So it can go too far, hear me. But without naming them so we don't get kicked off the internet today, do you know that there have been 7 national regimes since 1940 in countries with authoritarian leaders that have banned public comedy in order to control the narratives? Because the reason that the Notre Dame sociologist says that comedy matters is because there needs to be a place in all society where we can all walk into that place, laugh at the things that we all know, think, or question, and it be okay. Where things can be said there and critiques can be made there that actually lead us to greater pondering. And I'll be honest with you, comedians are the best communicators on the planet. They're great content developers. Their timing has to be perfect. They have to hold a room. They're incredible. Recently, I was listening to a guy named Pete Holmes, and he said it like this. When it came to that longing for God and making sense of the universe and our own lives, not a Christian, a secular atheist, and he said it like this. I'm going to read it to you in the manuscript just so we don't miss a single beat. You ready for this? Some people think God created the universe. Some people think nothing created the universe, which is the funniest of guesses. And the nothing people make fun of the God people. They say God doesn't exist. Okay, maybe he doesn't. But you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. That's the defining characteristic of nothing, is that it doesn't exist. So what are we talking about? Either you believe that it was God, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove, or you think it was nothing, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove. But I think we all agree, if your nothing sometimes spontaneously erupts and makes everything, that's a pretty blankety blanking, magical blanking nothing. That's a pretty incredible nothing. And ask the people what happens when you die if they believe that nothing made everything. They'll tell you when we die, nothing happens. We go back into nothing. And I look at them and say, you mean you merge back with your creator? And he looks at the crowd and he goes, that sounds like heaven. And it sounds like you're making the same arguments with different terms. Now, no scientist ever says that it's actually from nothing. Let me go a little academic for a second. I've spent some time in the ivory tower. I understand the scientific argument of singularity. I get it. But I know also that even if we're using scientific terms, that Dinesh D'Souza said that 14 billion years ago, that the universe was smaller than one atom, and then bam, explosion, and now all that was out of nowhere. So listen, I believe in a Big Bang to an extent for sure, because I think if God says let there be and there is, that thing probably exploded. But I also believe in the law of contingency, which means that nothing can't make it bang because nothing doesn't exist. Someone spoke and the cosmos were. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And sometimes Christians get made fun of for believing in a virgin birth. And I look at some of the most secular minds that I know who are well educated and can run circles around most of us academically. And I'm like, but you believe that about the universe. It sounds like me and you are just playing a game of choose your virgin. Either the universe is the virgin or Mary is. We're picking this. Who are we picking? Here we are in the middle of this game. Physicist Lee Smolin, Harvard educator, professor at the University of Toronto, said it like this, that the likelihood of all the dials in that one atom aligning to somehow make our universe is 1 in 10 to the 229th power. Holy cow is right, whoever that was. That's 229 zeros. To put that in perspective, a million's got 7. So the likelihood, he literally said 1 in the 10 to the 229th power refers to something so large that it is safe to say that such probability would be astronomically small and would likely correspond to an event that is considered highly improbable or effectively impossible within the framework of the current scientific understanding. So pick your virgin. Either God spoke and there was, Jesus incarnates, maker of the world, or coming from nothing. But what I do know for sure is that our longing, back off of apologetics for a second, back into the matters of your soul, you have longing for there to be a God who makes sense of the reason that you exist and why everything around you does. Friends, this is Gizmo. He's perfect. You want to talk about longing? Look in his eyes. Look in them. John Eldridge, a wonderful writer, said that you could look into the eyes of your pets and that something in your soul would know that when Genesis said that we were meant to live in harmony with all created things, their eyes remind our souls that it wasn't supposed to be this way. And he said you could look into the eyes of your pets because your pets, in essence, were simply this: messengers from Eden. That harmony was the way this was supposed to be. That there was longing for things to be right. Longing for there not to be loss. longing for there not to be goodbyes, even though that's all we've ever known. We're trying to make sense of the world. But you know what Gizmo does not do, I don't think? Whether he's in the redwoods, whether he's in the house, or whether he's dressed up like Baby Yoda. We're from LA, that stuff happens. He's got a pair of Converse sneakers as well, it's amazing. Be walking around Chuck Taylor's in the hard top. But you know what he doesn't do? He does not sit around and try to end human trafficking. Gizmo never sits around wondering why he exists or why the pain of the world does. He doesn't sit there and pull out a whiteboard and try to come up with some strategic way to get people who don't have clean water wells. You know what Gizmo's life consists of? Eat, play, sleep, go on walks, growl at the baby, lick private parts clean. That's literally all he does. And God willing, that's more. I hope that's not what your life is. But that's all his life consists of. But you and I will ask the question about our existence and whether or not it's consequential more times than we could pause to think. And we long for there to be a God, because if there is, that somehow makes us able to know things we once thought were unknowable. Namely, that there's something behind the universe. That if God created, then that means we innately have value. That also means that there's an ultimate good in the universe, and chaos will not always be king. And if there is an ultimate good, and that good is loving, then perhaps, since it is all existent eternally, that it would never end. That our core, humans long for things like purpose and love and identity and belonging, which are perfectly fulfilled in God's very person. Because his nature is love, goodness, and holiness. And it draws us back to the reality that we were made in his image and made for him. It's why David could look up at the stars in the sky and at the universe in Psalm 8 and shout to the longing being satisfied in the very person of God. In Psalm 8, 3-9, David said, "When I consider your heavens, when I consider the universe, if you will, the works of your finger, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind? What is our purpose? What are we that you are even mindful of us? Human beings, that you care for them, that you've made them only a little lower than angels and crowned them with glory and honor." This is the very verse that coined the term "enough to be loved" here, because you are this. Crowned with glory and honor. The apple of God's eye, the peak of his creation. You made them. Do we have purpose? You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all the flocks and the herds and the animals of the wild and the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea, all that swim in the paths of the sea. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all of the earth. Friends, we long for the person of God because it makes sense of the person of us and satisfies the longings of whether or not any of this matters. But not just at the cerebral, not just at the abstract, which is the temptation of apologetics, but to the personal, which is why the second point is not just that your longings find fulfillment in the person of God, but also in the presence of him. That in the personal sense, Psalm 16:11 said this, "You make known to me the path of life." That's a pretty big claim. That if you and I want to know the path of life, it is God who makes it known. Listen to this. In your presence, there is the full, unadulterated, non-messed up, ever existing, the fullness of joy. And at the right hand of you are pleasure forevermore. Friends, there is an ancient path embedded in those ancient words. And the path is simply this, that it is in God's presence, in his presence, where joy is known completely, where joy can be had in its fullness, and where pleasure one day doesn't get impeded by anything that's broken. Where? In his presence. That's why we long. What's the why question that we don't ask enough? Why do you long so desperately for connection in our world? Do you need it? Of course. It's a beautiful expression of what was meant to be ultimately fulfilled in connection with him. Why do you long so deeply for acceptance and belonging and intimacy and love? Friends, our deepest need is communion with God, a relational closeness that brings life and brings peace, a longing fulfilled in His presence, which heals us and restores us and satisfies us. And when we accept that God can give us these things in their fullness, I believe we suddenly become more brave to give it to others. Because the temptation for us is to worship others that give us those things. All of us. Our temptation is if we get a hit of that connection, if we get a hit of that level of acceptance, of that level of intimacy, of that level of closeness, it's for us to misappropriate our worship onto people. And friends, when we do that, they can't do anything but break. I remember looking at Casey. I think I probably worshiped Casey for some time in my life. I do. My adoration for Casey was through the moon. And one day Casey looked at me and said, I feel pressure in our relationship. I said, why do you feel pressure? You're perfect. And she said, that's why I feel pressure. Because you put me on a pedestal that I can't keep. I feel the pressure in that. We pressure people to be God all the time, or places and things to be God. But if we trust that though we have some moments of fulfillment in that the ultimate fulfillment is God, then we can be gracious to those who fail us when they don't meet the standard of perfect, because we never expected them to. We only expected God to be that place. And can we get honest and vulnerable for a second? We are tempted to worship people. There are people in this room, and you worship the guy you date. There are people in this room, and you worship the girl you date. There are people in this room that didn't get it from somebody else, and we didn't have that level of connection, and you worship the job that you hold. And that we worship that website you visit. And we worship the you name it. Because if we can get a hit of that drug, then maybe we can be temporarily satisfied, even though in our soul we know we won't be ultimately satisfied in putting it in other people. So instead of shaming us about it, I think it's worth redirecting the good in the longing. It is worth noting that all things that are sinful, are less than God's best, are fallen short of the glory of God, most of the ways that we sin are love gone wrong. Meaning there's usually good at the core of where we messed up. So instead of beating yourself up and hoping that shame sometimes and somehow is the healing balm of your wounds, notice when you're tempted to worship others, and in that moment acknowledge that the longing is because you acknowledge that you want to worship something, and direct it back to God. When you're in that moment, lean into His presence. Go there in prayer, knowing that He's never with you. Do not fall into the shame of this. Fall into change. Step into forward movement. Go back to God and release the people from the burden and chains of your expectations that they can't meet. They can't do it. It is in the presence of God you will feel joy, and I feel joy in my human connections all the time. And yet I know joy in its purest and its fullness is only ever found in one place. And yet because we long for the person of God to make sense of the person of us, it is good news that we get to experience His presence as the fulfillment of places that we long. I thumped off all Advent the message that the greatest gift about this life is that God is with us. And that we garner strength to continue from that. That Jesus in the Advent story is Emmanuel, sent to be God with us. So if you want that message, go back on the website. It's every message in November and December. But for a moment, I want to take the presence of God reality and travel down a path that very rarely is in the church. And it's this, that there's an invitation in human loneliness. We don't talk about loneliness a lot. And we don't talk about loneliness a lot because it feels like a unique way of suffering. We don't talk about loneliness a lot because often we're in seasons where we don't know how to solve it and that it can't be solved. We don't talk about loneliness a lot, even though it is a part of the human condition. We've all felt it in different seasons. Some of you have felt it in isolation. Some of you have been in a room full of people and never felt lonelier in your life. My heart breaks for some of you who are married and you feel alone in your marriage. There are deep moments of personal struggle that when our sin gets the best of us, we feel more lonely than we ever have. Lonely can be a gripping reality in our world, which is why we long not only for the person of God, but for the presence of Him with us. In loneliness, I believe there is a tri-directional invitation. The first of which is the first of that tri-directional invitation is to be present with the fact and the belief in trust and faith that God is with you when you're lonely. That even if you feel alone in a room or a relationship in a season, pausing, deep breath long enough, noticing even in your breath that you believe God gave it. Pausing long enough to say, even if I don't feel it at the level I wish I felt it, God, I trust that even right now, you have not left me and you did not forsake me, though I feel alone in this world. That even in the bitter reality of loneliness, maybe there's an invitation to be more present with God than we've ever been present with God before. The second directional invitation is that in our loneliness, we look forward to a day where loneliness doesn't exist. That we look forward to a day where all things are made new, where one day there will never be the loneliness felt. We will always be known, felt, seen, understood in the presence of God and others where nothing impedes it or breaks it. And we acknowledge that at our deepest place we long for that day too. But we hold the belief that that day comes. And the third direction of that invitation is this, that it gives us the courage to be present with those who also feel lonely and pain. That loneliness is a reality, and we all face it. And there's an invitation to be present with God, to be thankful that there's a day coming where this no longer exists, even if I feel it today, and to be brave enough to be present with others who are lonely also. One scholar said it like this: we are not called by God to do extraordinary things, but to do ordinary things with extraordinary love. In our loneliness, we discover this love, a love that does not leave us even in our emptiest moments. The presence of God is the place that many of our deepest longings are actually fulfilled. I love how Donald Blow said it. He said, our greatest affliction is not anxiety, though anxiety is afflicting. It's not even guilt, but rather homesickness, a nostalgia of the soul, a yearning to be at home with God. Which leads me to our final point. Not just that we long for the person of God to make sense of the person of us. Not just that we long for the presence of God even in our loneliest or our most joyful moments, but we also long for the promised kingdom of God. For the kingdom to come into full actualization. I'm going to read you an excerpt and a little breaking patchy work on Isaiah 35, taking bits and pieces of it that paint this beautiful image for all of time that I think we need to cling to and I don't think we can afford to miss. It was in Isaiah 35 where it said, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. Then will the eyes of the blind be open and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. And a highway will be there, and it will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way, for they will enter Zion with singing, and everlasting joy will crown their heads. Listen to this. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Friends, I don't care where you come from. You long for that day where sorrow and sighing and brokenness and pain have only one option, and it's to run the other direction. Where the image is a parched soul in a parched world and a parched land would gush forth with living water that brought things to bloom where death had once lived. Do you know that you long for things that don't make any sense? Why do you long for justice? Because on face value, it's dumb. Why do you long for justice? You've never lived in a world where justice reigned. Ever. What does it make you to long for things that you've never seen exist? You long for poverty to end, and you've never known a world without poverty. We all long for suffering and cancer and school shootings and child trafficking. We all long for that to cease, and it's all we've ever known. There's a why behind our longing. There is deeper water to explore. We long for those things and we fight for those things, but there's no evidence in our world that those are the things that reign. So hear me, either that makes you crazy or dumb or full of naive optimism that your body and your brain create to keep you numb in the world, or we know the truth. That we know in our souls that the human experience wasn't supposed to be littered with these things. That our soul knows it. That we were created to be the kind of humanity that reflects the longings that are fulfilled. That we were meant to be those who reflect beauty, creativity, love-making, music, and the goodness of God. If we are just a puddle of atoms, friends, then who the flip cares? Who cares? Who cares about justice? Things that are broken are actually just natural selection having its course and wiping out the weaker and lessers of us. There's no ultimate evil. There's no ultimate suffering. There's no ultimate law of the universe. You're a bunch of atoms banging together in every way I can use that word, and none of it matters. But you don't believe it. Even if you're in this room and you don't yet believe in Jesus, you do not really believe that. And I don't say that to manipulate you. I say that because I believe it. You don't believe it. If you do, stand up and tell us, point at them. Who's the lessers? Is it people with different skin than you? Is it people with disabilities? Who's the who doesn't matter? Whose this is all a cosmic accident? You can't point at them because your soul knows they don't exist. Your soul knows what we just read, that mankind was crowned with dignity and honor. And somehow, if our longing is that there's a God, it makes sense of us. And that if He's with us, He can get us through our experiences. And if a promised kingdom in its fullness is coming, then we dedicate ourselves to the way of God now as we go to that day forward. There's an answer behind your longings. I love how Rodney Stark, when he wrote in his book, The Rise of Christianity, and he referenced the work of the French philosopher Jean-Claude Ferry, and he said it like this: in direct contradiction to the world, Christianity was to introduce the notion that humanity was fundamentally identical, that men and women were equal in dignity, an unprecedented idea at the time, and one of which our entire world owes its entire democratic inheritance. This idea of human equality may seem self-evident, but it was unheard of at the time in the rest of the world. And as it turned out, it turned an entire world order upside down. You know it in your soul. You know that you long for these things. What Lewis said clearly was that even when the things we long for in our world seem to come from somewhere else because our world hasn't really ever known them. He said it like this: if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. We long for the kingdom that Isaiah described as gushing spring waters that revive desert lands. We know that somehow that's how it was supposed to be, full of life, where sorrow has to run away and flee. I'll conclude like this. You long for the person of God because he makes sense of the person of you. We long for the presence of God and the fact that he would ever be with us in it even when the shadows of loneliness creep in. And we long for the promised kingdom where joy never ends and death has to die. And the only reason you have such bold hope, and the only reason I'm bold enough to come out this way and say it, is because Jesus wins and because Jesus reigns. That Jesus died so that you have hope for better days. That the tomb is empty, and because the tomb is empty, your emptiness one day will be put in a tomb. And because Jesus rose, our longings find home in him. So each new day now we choose to let our hearts take residency in his presence, for there joy reigns. We've been ending lately a lot by reading the Psalms. Our team got to interview N.T. Wright recently, foremost New Testament scholar breathing on our planet today. And he said this, he said, for the first time in Christian history, the church isn't corporately praying the Psalms together. So you saw several months ago us ending services by reading the prayers of those who wrote prayers in the past and attaching them to our lives and our moment now. So I want to end today in this conclusion of the whys behind the things we long for with a prayer of David, Psalm 63, just the first 8 verses that speak to God being the one who fulfills the longings. And would you just posture yourself in prayer to listen, to hear, and to make his words yours. This beautiful psalm reads like this: You, God, are my God, and earnestly I seek you, thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. And because your love, listen to this, church, because your love is better than life. I'll read it again so we make it our prayer in our hearts. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live. And in your name I lift my hands. And I will be fully satisfied as if with the riches of food. With a singing lips, my mouth will praise you. And on my bed, I remember you and I think of you through the watches of the night, because you are my help. And I sing in the shadows of your wings. I cling to you, for your right hand upholds me. Father, give us more of who you are, more of your presence, and more aware of where we are ambassadors of the kingdom here and now, with greater hope, greater courage, and greater bravery, knowing that the days are coming where the things that are broken are made straight, are made right, are made correct, are made whole. In Jesus' name, amen.